Hello. After our last episode, our discussion continued and it became interesting. We started talking about the alphabet in terms of higher dimensionality or higher consciousness, and it proved to be pretty interesting. So we decided to make another episode on that discussion, which is fitting since this is episode 27. We are commemorating the 27 letter Hebrew alphabet. So enjoy.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah, what I
Yeah.
wanted to say was just how universal the letters are, and we go deeply into real truths about life and
Yeah.
awareness and
See,
self,
that's the point.
how we
That's
move
the point.
forward in life. It's
Yeah.
the letters have so much to teach us.
How do you
Yeah.
take, symbols, two-dimensional symbols, and extend that into everything?
But on the other hand, are they two-dimensional symbols, or did they start off as hand gestures, as expressions of our consciousness?
Well, that's Stan's thesis.
Yeah.
I saw this in Share Ora, which is this book that references the three levels. It directly references exactly what we're talking about as nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Like again, physical, spiritual, and archetypal.
Yeah.
I mean, directly. I mean, it's unbelievable. But he says an amazing thing about writing in the introduction. So I forgot who wrote the introduction. Maybe it's his introduction. He writes there that like writing is like all it does is activates our memory. It's nothing real. It's just two-dimensional.
Perfect.
Right?
Perfect.
Isn't that
Exactly.
unbelievable?
Yeah.
And he gives an example, like let's say I say Michael Andron, right? I write it down and I see your name, right?
Mhm.
All of a sudden, all these things come up in my consciousness, but the letters themselves aren't you. It's the consciousness that holds my memories and my interactions with you. And so he uses like whatever, some other name, but like so what's neat about what we have here and what Stan brought into the world, what you both brought into the world, is that it kind of bridges that gap between the written and then the consciousness. It kind of goes between and actually beyond.
Well, Daniel, how does
It
that
actually,
differ?
right, it actually goes back to an idea that Stanley had very, very early, which was thinking of the letter text of Bereshit in particular as a meditation. If you follow the consciousness that is evoked by each individual letter as you go through it. And I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, Daniel, that was exactly what this rabbi must have been saying.
Pretty much, yeah.
He was working with the Hebrew alphabet.
Absolutely, that's exactly what he was saying, and he was right in that. It's very important thing. It's precisely that's what the whole book is like. I'm going back to Spain and the 13th century, and it's like I'm reading an explanation of what Stan kind of worked on his whole life, and vice versa. It's like it's
So
yeah,
Daniel,
it's phenomenal.
how does what you were just saying about notes on a page differ from musical notation? Dots. They're lines with dots, and so let's say nobody knows what music is and looks at it, it's gibberish. But what is that? Look what that represents.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because it's what's similar, I guess, to the hand model is that it represents hand movements.
Mm-hmm.
Notes represent hand movements on any instrument, whether it's the wind or brass. If you're playing the trombone or the French horn, it's these fingers and your other. It's always with the hands and with the fingers, the musical notes, and correspondingly, because I think it has to do with the hands, it has to do with our consciousness. It's a very powerful tool for better or worse, for manipulation of consciousness. So that's a great point because there is this direct connection, I think, between music and consciousness, and between music and what Meru has done and is doing.
Well, we have thought, right? And thought is coming through the OTO, through the letters, into some form of action or creation. So if we go with that Kabbalistic concept of the role of the OTO in any creation, it's very similar. It's like you envision the theme or the kind of sound you're looking for or the quality. And then you use these notes, like little OTOs come down on the page, and then they're interpreted into somebody's hand as they like try to play it on a flute or play it on a violin. So there's just this beautiful weaving of creativity. You could say it's all OTOs, right? It's all the letters that are coming down into your reality of the music.
It's
Of the
actually
notes that the OTO are interpreting. There's has to be that place of the transformation between the thought and the action is
well, it
in these
becomes
letters.
a perfect meditation and joins spiritual and physics together, because if you imagine that God created this space for a world and everything that, I don't mean Earth, but the entire universe is inside an imaginary bubble, and white light is coming through it. As it passes through the membrane of that bubble, it's broken up like a prism. It's like waves. God's wave comes into that bubble and becomes particles. And the particles become the theoretical letters still in the remnant of thought, and then to primitive man became gesture, and in time began to have their own meanings, and created languages and all the other. But it's taking the physics of a wave being a wave until you look at it, as what you were saying before, Daniel. Once you look at it, once you pay attention and focus your intention on it, it becomes a particle. So when God looked into the Torah, he saw waves. The letters were still moving. Everything was moving. It was waves, like a hologram negative. You don't see the picture of the apple. You only see, lines and stuff. Then you shoot the laser through it, and you see the three-dimensional picture. And that's essentially creation,
cool.
but it's creation from waves to particles.
Well, that's I'm not remembering the exact quote, Daniel. Maybe you do. That again, we used very early, but I know I've seen it. That that the Torah was originally without, the letters of the Torah were originally without definition into words, and as events happened, it
froze.
divided itself into the appropriate words. And if different events had happened, the words would be different. And I can't remember the source. Maybe you do. Okay, I've got
can't
it.
remember.
It's a pretty classic one, though. I've seen it in a number of places. Yeah.
I remember a
I think
captain
it's in
quoted it.
Stan's book.
Yeah,
Well,
I was just going to say, it's in your
He
book.
talks about
I
that
don't have it
same
next to me, or I'd
cross.
look it up in
Yeah.
the notes.
Yeah, no, it's something that Stan talked about.
Yeah, and it is classic. Yeah,
I've heard
it's
it,
not
yeah.
an easy concept to really, I mean, you really have to know the letters and meanings to get that, because how does this story come out of just, how did it just all fit? And and in some ways it doesn't, because when you look at the translation of the Torah, sometimes what it just doesn't quite work.
Well, that's more granular. Where you are, Bill, with that comment is somewhat more granular than I think whoever it was that wrote this particular metaphor way of thinking of the Torah.
Well, that's all you're going to get out of me. So
that's fine. You bring us back to that level, which is important.
No,
I think the idea of God looking into the Torah to create creation, I think that was in the Zohar.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that it was, but if it wasn't, it was certainly in ancient texts.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Because it's a it's a helpful model, because as soon as you say he looked into the Torah and he created creation, how did he create? Abraham wasn't there yet. Moses wasn't there yet. How did he look into the Torah? Was the Torah written? So, but as life with its multiple possibilities infinite possibilities began to happen, then the letters sort of froze in place and the story now went from wave to particle and set itself in time space or space time.
Right. So this book, Shari Ora, is it's right around the time that they discovered the Zohar. So it part of, some of it is pre-Zohar Kabbalah, which is
I
interesting.
feel like we have to move a little bit away from how you were just describing that, Michael, in terms of he wrote down, because the image of an entity doing that is, we need to move away from that. It's some, as Stan put, a transcendent source, that something happened, an energy of oneness made that happen. Now, the letters are elements of energy, put together in a form that creation happens. But I know that rabbis today explain it the way you just did, in terms of how did he do that? How did he put that together? And I know it's a metaphor, but still, I'm trying to get beyond that
But
idea.
it's difficult, Bill,
It is
because
difficult.
I mean, how does language happen? How did, according to the Midrash, Adam named all the things? He said, "This is a horse. This is a soos. This is this is tzon. This is this. This is that." And we learn language by, we point at something and say, "That's a wheel." So now the child knows the word wheel is that. We attach it to something physical. And creation started that way too. But when you're talking, say, on a podcast like this, you have people coming in who have no knowledge of that mystical thing. They might know that particles and waves through that experiment, when you look at it, suddenly becomes a particle. But I don't know how that happens. Maybe the physicists do, but it does happen.
It doesn't have it. It's not that it becomes a particle. It's that you can look at it in different ways depending upon what you want to see. And the assumption is that when it passes through that plane, it uses its wave-like qualities to do that. But then when it's on the other side, you can perceive it once again as a particle.
But it also maintains the
words
memory.
don't describe physics either.
No,
And
Right.
that's
they don't.
something that non-physicists
But
can
we're also
forget.
we're moving from a level of consciousness which we can't define, our higher consciousness, into a physical reality. And that was what Stan was talking about early on. He kept the tagline for Meru was that this was a way of bridging the gap between science and physics and consciousness. Those were the terms that were used, consciousness and physics.
Yeah.
Well, not having a background in either one at first, I wasn't sure what that meant. What is consciousness? Well, we know what physics is, but we didn't know what consciousness was. And still today we don't. It depends who's talking about. If a doctor's talking about consciousness, he's talking about either you're awake or not,
or
alive.
unconscious. Yeah.
But those who work, I'm not going to use that term again, consciousness, whatever, raising, we look at it as perhaps the difference between inside and outside.
Well, consciousness raising is more a matter.
I know we talked about that once.
That
it
doesn't have anything to do with spiritual consciousness.
Right. Okay.
In
any case, so what I'm saying is, Michael, that maybe, yes, we don't have the language. Maybe what we're doing here is developing the seeds of the language that,
maybe as we talk, it's important to be clear when what we're actually doing is quoting or referring to ancient sources which did use that language, and that's where we have to start. And then what it means, if we're actually quoting somebody who wrote back in the 1200s, then it's only respectful to them to first say it in their metaphor, because they were using metaphor also, just one appropriate to their time, and then translate it to our metaphor, which would, preferred metaphor for this century is gender neutral, and in some cases individual consciousness neutral, although when you're talking about God, that is an open question if you're actually concerned about it, in terms of having a personal relationship with the deity, or et cetera. That's a whole other discussion.
But as Adele points out, continuing that, we are creating new drashas, and as members of the tribe, we have the right and ability to do that. And
Yeah.
so the more we do it, the more maybe the clarity comes through. There's not a lot of people talking about what we're talking about right now.
I'm just saying that if what we're, those of us or those of you who draw from a knowledge of having read those sources for yourself, that, if that it's important to say, okay, this comes from us, or to be clear,
Right,
that
sure.
this is a metaphor from 1,000 years ago, and
Right.
here's how I might say it if I were translating it today.
Sure.
that's a good point.
100%. There is an interesting idea, absolutely. There's an interesting idea, Rabbi Nachman, this kind of bridges the gap here, which is Rabbi Nachman says that actually the whole Torah is different names of God. That the letters, each letter is basically a name of God. So that idea is an older idea. I think I forgot where he got it from, but he definitely talks about that. And the idea of learning Torah is actually to look at names of God. So in order to get us out of craziness, that's what he says, to get us out of the craziness of being stuck down here, and to kind of open our mind to God, but in
Well,
not capital G,
yeah.
the one, the source of light, however ever want to put it.
And I think that Rabbi Nachman was obviously aware of that. I mean, he
Right.
thought on that level, but again, he was talking back in the 1800s, and
sure.
What metaphors do you use if you're back in that time?
Sure.
If he lived now, he would use different metaphors.
That's true.
100%.
And Rabbi Nachman, as well as his grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, spent a lot of time in nature. They went out and they had experiences which they came back and spoke about in their language, getting back to your point, Lavana. But if we look into their language and think about their experiences, that's something we can relate to. The idea of going into a forest and having this transcendent experience, and then coming back and then interpreting that into some language. And they didn't even write it. It was their followers who did all the writing. They just came and spoke about it, and then the followers had to figure out what the heck they were talking about.
And the followers inevitably, almost always, were not at the same level as the person who was actually saying the thing.
That's totally
so
true.
There's a couple of levels of
more than a couple.
And here we are, the followers of Stan.
Pixelation, let's put it that way.
We're the followers of Stan trying to,
I mean, I can't say these things. Not well. Daniel says them better in some ways because he's got the kind of background that Stanley was looking into. I mean, it was I have zero Hebrew background except what I learned through working on this work.